Welcome everyone to the Ocean Hub Public Consultation webinar. We will be starting in a few minutes and just give everyone a moment to join and get settled. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the webinar for the public consultation of the Science-Based Targets Network Ocean Hub, our version 1.0 guidance. My name is Alice Thomas-Smith. I am the technical co-lead from WWF of the Ocean Hub. I will be one of your speakers today. On the next slide, I'd just like to do a brief introduction for you. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. We will be running for about 1 hour today. We will be hearing from Varsha Vijay, the Science-Based Targets Network Technical Director. You will also be hearing from Taylor Witkin, who's the technical co-lead of the Ocean Hub from Conservation International. You will then later on be hearing from me again. Again, I'm the technical co-lead from WWF. Today we are supported by Erin O'Grady from SBTN, Klaus DeVos, and you will also be, when you are entering your questions in the Q&A, we are supported by Susanna Bryan, who is a seafood markets manager at WWF and works on corporate engagement for the Ocean Hub. You may see her name answering questions for you. You may hear her later on helping us answer your questions. We will be presenting for about 35 to 40 minutes and then leaving time at the end for your questions. So please feel free to answer them throughout the presentations, and we will be leaving the time towards the end. Any questions we do not have time to answer, we will be keeping track of them and sending out answers after the webinar. So again, thank you so much for joining. And as you said, we are going to be recording this and sending out the recording afterwards as well. And with that, I will be passing over to Varsha. Thank you so much for joining us today, Varsha.
Thank you, Alice, and huge congratulations to the Ocean Hub on this important milestone in the development of the first ocean science-based targets. So for those of you who are newer to SBTN, I'm going to start with a little bit of grounding and information on SBTN, who we are as an organization. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So first of all, who are we? We are a mission-driven organization. We are a nonprofit organization, a unique collection of over 80 leading global environmental nonprofits, international organization, mission-driven organizations. We're really a collective of the world's leading scientists and sustainability experts, and we've come together to equip companies and cities with the guidance, tools, and methods they need to operate within Earth's limits while also meeting society's needs. That means we are a voluntary initiative producing target-setting methodologies for companies. Today, we'll be focusing on that specifically for our ocean methodologies. Next, please. So you can go to the next slide, please. So many of you have probably heard of SBTI. That's our sister organization that focuses on science-based targets for climate. We're building on SBTI's momentum and the framing of science-based targets in order to go beyond that to build out science-based targets for nature. In doing so, we're recognizing that climate and nature are inexorably linked, that to take effective action on climate requires taking action on nature and building out a really holistic framework, working across different dimensions of nature. So we recognize in doing so that nature is the foundation of our economy and of our lives, which is why the founding organizations of SBTI are also the founding members of the Science-Based Targets Network. So as I've already said, we develop science-based targets for nature, both for companies and cities, so they can comprehensively address their environmental impacts. And we'll go into a little bit more what really this means. Next, please. So SBTN provides an integrated approach for companies to address their environmental impacts. Within SBTN are technical hubs that cover 4 key action areas: freshwater, land, ocean, and biodiversity, cross-cutting all of those. These complement the ongoing efforts of SBTI to guide companies' actions on nature. So in essence, what we're doing is to enable companies to take the right actions in the right places at the right time to do their part to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. Next, please. But before we go forward, it's important to define what exactly we mean by science-based targets. So we draw on the best available science, including alignment with Earth's limits, the science of Earth system boundaries, planetary boundaries, and other pieces that we're directly drawing on. Societal sustainability goals as well, like the Global Biodiversity Framework and Sustainable Development Goals. And we create targets that are measurable, actionable, and time-bound objectives based on that best available science that allow actors to align with Earth's limits and societal sustainability goals. Can we move forward to the next slide? Great. So I'm going to be walking you through an overview of our methodology. So until now, we've kind of talked about SBTN's approach, our mission and vision. But to enable companies to set science-based targets for nature, SBTN has designed a 5-step approach that builds on existing corporate practices. That means that, for example, in the seafood sector, where there are a lot of available guidance, initiatives, certifications, this process is complementing those and building from them rather than kind of enabling duplication. This process takes companies from assessing their impacts on nature through their value chains to identifying what parts of their business and which locations they should focus on to setting targets. Those are the science-based targets that are going to be at the center of our discussions today, implementing actions to meet those targets, and finally, monitoring, reporting, and verifying progress against those targets. So this 5-step process is really presented here as a kind of linear process, but it's important to keep in mind that this is actually iterative for companies. Though companies move through these steps sequentially, they'll need to go back and refresh their assessments and evaluations over time as conditions change, the science grows, and company structure and sourcing shifts as well. So to kind of walk you through a little bit more what exactly you do in that methodology, SBTN moves companies through this process for target setting, beginning with understanding their pressures on nature, that first step of the cycle. So with that information, companies are then going to set targets using the specific scientific guidance, like the experts in the Ocean Hub has set out for them. So that's kind of the focus of the second half of this presentation. Part of the value proposition of science-based targets for nature is that the approach begins with a holistic or comprehensive assessment of the impacts of nature. So across all those dimensions of nature that we already discussed, freshwater, land, ocean, biodiversity, and including climate through references to SBTI, so they can understand where their significant impacts are and what to address first. And it's also important to understand that these are prescriptive methods. They provide a clear set of steps that companies must go through, really taking the guesswork out of estimating impacts and prioritizing locations for actions. Next, please. Companies then use the methodology in our step 2 guidance to prioritize the business activities and locations where they need to set targets first. This allows them to focus their attention and resources for target setting in the places that need it most. This is first based on an impact approach, understanding the largest pressures they have or the regions in their supply chain with the greatest biodiversity need, and then complemented with an assessment of stakeholder engagement, human rights considerations, corporate strategic ambitions, and risk and business dependencies. This holistic approach results in incorporation of a sort of double materiality approach aligned with a lot of initiatives in this space and helps inform effective strategy towards target setting and then action for nature. Next, as the company moves into step 3, and this is going to be something that we're going to dive into more detail in a moment as the Ocean Hub walk us through the first ocean science-based targets, companies move through the target setting process to actually begin setting targets in step 3, depending on those material impacts. So they will set targets for ocean, for freshwater, land, and climate through SBTI. Biodiversity is integrated within these targets with work underway to ensure even better outcomes for biodiversity through this target setting process. After target setting, SBTN already has some guidance for target implementation, but more detailed guidance is anticipated in this coming year. This piece of guidance, or called ACT, really focuses on driving action to achieve science-based targets in alignment with the SBTN action framework built on the conservation mitigation hierarchy. This guidance is again integrated, helping companies to understand the impacts of their action across the various dimensions of nature in the science-based targets, highlighting outcomes for biodiversity and human societies. And then finally, as we proceed to step 5, companies will monitor and report their progress towards their target. This is a piece of work that's yet to come, with SBTN providing some initial guidance on this so far. So why is SBTN's work so valuable to the scientific community, and how is it rooted in that best available science? So first, it is credible. It's rooted in that best available science, but it's also backed by civil society. So you see in our component organizations that work on this method development and weigh in that they're the world's leading NGOs. It's also interoperable. It's developed in alignment and collaboration with global initiatives like TNFD, EU CSRD, and many more. And as I said early on, it's location-based. We understand that in nature, as it's also true for climate, but less centered, the actions that are taken are really must be, actions and targets rather, must be really implemented in the context of the place in which they are occurring. So that's where the company's impacts are occurring. It's also a prescriptive piece of guidance, so it's clear and stepwise with clarity on impact assessment and prioritization, as well as target setting. It's also intended to balance this need for science with feasibility. We work in a co-development manner. Methods are tested with users to be more impactful and practical, and processes like our public consultation right now ensure that we get the widest array of feedback to ensure that these methods are really applicable and actionable on release. And finally, these methods are comprehensive. Right now, we're going to be talking about the ocean methods, but they exist in a context of all the other methodologies that SBTN produces to address different dimensions of nature loss and impacts. Next slide, please. And finally, before handing it over to the Ocean Hub, a little bit of the business case for SBTN. First, utilizing SBTN's methods has been shown to reduce risk. So biodiversity risk is recognized as an important and likely business risk alongside climate change and water crises. And by participating in the SBTN process, companies can reduce business risk and help create positive impact on marine and coastal systems they depend on, rather than only trying to limit harm. It also can be a piece that enhances brand reputation. So companies are increasingly opting for brands that provides sustainable and ethical product choices for seafood and other ocean-based products and services. Setting SBTs enables companies to meet the demand of their consumers and also that pressure and drive for action. It also grows investment. So investors are increasingly committed to integrated action, environmental action across ESG principles into their investment practices and ownership policies. Setting science-based targets can help companies align with their goals of their investors or financiers. The Ocean Hub has also worked with UNEP-FI, and that effort has already led to guidance for investors to set targets. Investors and financial institutions to set targets in the blue economy with an emphasis on seafood systems. And finally, it's important for companies to use voluntary initiatives like SBTN in order to align with global frameworks and also go beyond existing regulation and policy changes aimed at securing a nature-positive future, and even allow companies to drive policy in the right direction to create effective action and outcomes for nature. So with that, I'd love to hand over to Taylor to go over the first ocean science-based targets. Thank you.
Thanks, Varsha. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. My name is Taylor Whitkin. I'm the Program Manager for Ocean Metrics and Responsible Business at Conservation International and co-lead the Ocean Hub alongside Alice. First, I just want to take a moment to thank the organizations that have helped us get to this point. Our funders, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation. And then we're also supported by our steering committee who have contributed their time and expertise to this work. So what we're presenting today is really a team effort beyond just CI, WWF, and SBTN. The Ocean Hub's purpose is to develop guidance using SBTN methodology for the ocean realm, starting specifically with the seafood industry and eventually expanding beyond so that the guidance is relevant and accessible by really the entire blue economy. So when we publish our guidance, this will be added to SBTN's existing guidance developed by the land and freshwater hubs so that companies with varied and diverse supply chains and operations can really take a holistic approach to addressing their impacts and pressure on nature and biodiversity. Next slide. So our goal here today is to really orient you for the public consultation process. We published our draft guidance last week, and the public consultation runs until October 22nd. Our goal is to solicit as much feedback from this community as possible on the clarity of the guidance, feasibility for companies, and scientific foundation so that we can incorporate that and really enhance the guidance as much as possible as we prepare for publication in early 2025 so that companies can begin setting science-based targets for the ocean. Next slide. So our guidance is broken down into four major components. We have we have 3 targets focusing on different parts of the ocean and nature and biodiversity in the ocean, and then also a prerequisite social responsibility commitment, acknowledging that there's a deep connection between social responsibility and environmental responsibility in ocean industries and particularly within seafood systems. And this commitment is aligned with SBTN's work developing stakeholder engagement guidance. Next slide. So this guidance is structured for companies with both wild capture and aquaculture seafood in their supply chains. This will range from direct operators, so fishing and aquaculture companies, all the way to retailers, though we're anticipating that companies at the latter end of the supply chain will be early adopters and first movers when it comes to setting science-based targets for the ocean. Our avoid overexploitation target covers wild fisheries, helping companies avoid reliance on commodities that are derived from overexploited stocks. Our protect structural marine habitats target covers both aquaculture and wild fisheries, helping companies avoid and reduce impacts on structural habitats in marine and transitional environments. So thinking about coral reefs, seagrass beds, mangroves, other bottom habitats. And for wild seafood here, this target focuses mainly on gear-based impacts and degradation from that. So again, just looking at bottom habitat for now. Our third target, reduce risk to endangered, threatened, and protected marine wildlife populations, specifically, again, focuses on wild capture fishing. And here we're focusing on risk to marine wildlife, given the challenge of connecting observed and known interactions with marine wildlife to specific products within supply chains. And this target and our habitats target, we think, can also form a foundation for that future expansion of the methodology beyond seafood to other ocean sectors and companies within the blue economy. Something that Alice will also get into more detail later is that these three targets share a common thread of engagement, pushing companies to help achieve positive conservation outcomes for the relevant component of nature that they're addressing and engaging in restoration and regeneration. So trying to move beyond just reducing and avoiding harm. Next slide. So each of these targets uses a set of indicators and metrics by which companies assess the state of nature or the health of a given component of the ocean and measure pressure generated by either their direct operations or by upstream stakeholders in their supply and value chain. Indicators are broad in scope and signal the presence or absence of a particular condition. And metrics provide a precise value for how to measure that indicator. And so companies will use these indicators and metrics to set those time-bound, actionable, ambitious targets. For our avoid overexploitation target, companies will use their sourcing volume of wild capture seafood and the stock health status as indicators to determine how they will set their targets. So this depends on if the stock is overexploited, how long that overexploitation may have been occurring, and that will influence the timing and the level that companies will set their targets at, whether that's reducing their sourcing from a specific stock, capping their sourcing at a certain level, or engaging in an initiative that will achieve those positive conservation outcomes. Next slide. So the indicators and metrics for our habitats target can be a bit more varied just because this covers pressure from both aquaculture and fishing, and also covers a variety of habitats and a variety of pressures on those habitats depending on the gear type used, the type of aquaculture operation that a company is engaged in. And so while companies will need to identify and learn about the state of nature within the habitats that they're operating in or sourcing from, this target mainly relies on pressure indicators, which include externalities like habitat conversion, degradation, or pollution that negatively impact surrounding habitats. So companies will be measuring and setting targets based on those pressures in an effort to improve state of nature. And then our third target, reduce risk to endangered, threatened, and protected marine wildlife, is developed by having companies examine the spatial and temporal overlaps between fishing activities and marine wildlife that might be interacting with those fishing operations. So here, companies will look at the gear used and the potential risk that that gear causes to non-target species, as well as where and when fishing is occurring to determine that level of risk and the risk of interaction with the marine wildlife. And they'll set targets that are meant to help them reduce and avoid that pressure or contribute to positive conservation outcomes for a given marine wildlife population. And so with that, I will pass it over to Alice to talk about the different pathways that companies can take to setting targets, which will largely depend on the indicators that I discussed here. And she'll also get into more details about the public consultation.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Yes, like Taylor was saying, our targets, if you are familiar with the other targets that have been published by the Land Hub and the Freshwater Hub within SBTN, have a slightly unique structure in that we have introduced pathways that allow for companies to have multiple approaches to target setting that are largely dependent on a company's position in the supply chain, the types of commodities they have, or the types of pressures or the ways that their actions create those pressures on the ocean. As you can see here, we have our three targets that Taylor just introduced. Target 1 for avoid and reduce overexploitation, target 2 to protect structural habitats, and target 3 to reduce risk to endangered, threatened, and protected marine wildlife. Under each of those targets, we have different pathways to setting your target. And these targets, these pathways, there is uniformity across the targets, as you can see. There's unique pathways under each, but also uniformity. We have similarities in the types of pathways, thus named in operations, engagement, and then some unique ones called reduction and cessation. And we will not go into the technical details of these really thoroughly today, but just to know that these are and have different mechanisms, but their goal is to recognize the unique placements that different companies in the seafood sector may have based on where they are in the value chain and the types of operations they have, the types of commodities they have, and allow them different pathways towards target setting. And particularly, we'd like to talk about the engagement pathway on the next slide, as we think this is a really unique opportunity, but quite similar to the landscape engagement pathway from the Land Hub, if you're familiar with that target. This is, as you saw on the last slide, available to companies in all three of our targets. Some companies may be required to set a different pathway, but they are always it is always available to them to also set an engagement pathway target. This is entirely structured around best practices for corporate engagement in seafood, which is to see companies engage in the regions that they are sourcing seafood from, the communities, the management areas, and the actual fisheries or aquaculture facilities where they are sourcing from. Many of the organizations on our steering committee, the organizations that Taylor and myself work from, have seen a lot of success in having companies do direct engagements in this way. The goal of an engagement pathway target is to lead to improvements in seascapes or jurisdictions relevant to a company's direct or upstream pressures, or the state of nature relevant to that target. As Taylor was just describing, those state of nature indicators are specific to each of target, but the overall goal of the engagement pathway is to lead to improvements. So that's really a unique value add that we believe that we are able to bring to SBTN, is those best practices for corporate engagement in seafood. On the next slide, we want to just give you a little example of what targets actually look like within the Ocean Hub. So these are example targets that a company would come up with. Anything in bold or within brackets are the unique aspects of a target that would come out of the company doing those step 1 And step 2, processes that Varsha discussed earlier. So they would, and in step 3, they would come up with a target end date. A company, so for a reduction pathway target, a company would reduce the sourcing of a specific species from its stock name by that percentage reduction compared to a baseline. The next example we want to show you is a cessation target. So this is if a company has their sourcing is posing an extreme risk to a critically endangered marine wildlife species. This is a pretty uncommon target that a company would need to set. We do not really believe that companies should need to cease sourcing unless it's a really critical risk. The next target we want to show is operational. This is companies enacting standards of best practice that we pull from the literature at a fishery or aquaculture facility to avoid impacts to found habitats. And then finally, this is an example of those engagement targets. This is one specifically for reducing risks to endangered, threatened, or protected marine wildlife. It could be structured slightly differently for any of the 3 targets, but these we just want to show you examples of, and I know we're going pretty fast, but you will be able to see these slides. And of course, all of this information is available in the guidance documents, but some examples of what targets actually look like when you come out of the SBTN process through the Ocean Hub. Companies set these very specific targets that are publicly available and are making very specific information available about what they are doing with their targets. So that's the information about the technical guidance that we are producing. And now we want to talk about the public consultation. Our public consultation period, as Taylor said, went live on the 10th. I believe we'll be posting a link to the website where you can go to find out information. But the public consultation involves 4 pieces of draft documentation. Everything is currently in draft form. We've been spending a lot of time with all of those institutions that Taylor mentioned and more, drafting these documents. The first piece documentation is our step 3 guidance for the seafood value chain. This contains all that technical information that Taylor talked about how companies would transition from steps 1 and 2 to step 3 for the Ocean Hub, all the technical details about the targets and the pathways, the data requirements and kind of decision trees for companies to really clarify what exactly needs, which targets are required depending on a company's operations and supply chains. Along with that guidance document, we've also developed 3 draft data submission forms. These are Excel spreadsheets, one for each of our 3 targets. And these are set up for companies to submit the data necessary for their target validation. And these are really helpful because companies can then see exactly what data is required for submission. And we're really excited to be able to provide these during our public consultation to receive feedback on these as well, of what data is and isn't available, if there's a better format to be submitting the data in for feasibility reasons. So those are available for the public consultation as well. On the next slide, our public consultation, we are open to any and all feedback, of course, during the public consultation period, but we have drafted some specific questions that reflect our learnings during a corporate pilot that we have gone through and the development of the guidance over the last 1.5 years with our steering committee. These questions follow some major themes which have a lot of overlap and interconnectedness. First, there's a lot of highly technical information in this guidance document, and we would welcome feedback on our target thresholds and timelines when a target is triggered, the difference between those pathways, how long a company has to set and achieve a target, etc. Then these major themes, especially we're interested in hearing back from companies on the feasibility, their data availability, the clarity and prescriptiveness of our guidance, and then, of course, from everyone in the community, science experts, etc., on all of these themes, the ambition level of these targets particularly, and as we were discussing those engagement initiatives, how well are these suited to the types of engagements that we are seeing from companies, how achievable are they, etc. And the way to get this feedback back to us, on that link that was just posted in the chat and that we've been kind of posting on LinkedIn and is available through SBTN's website. You can provide feedback in several ways. There is a Google form which would submit feedback directly, very specific questions available, as well as an open comment section at the end. All of those questions are also available in a Google Doc that you could download and fill out and then attach to an email and send directly to Taylor and myself. You are also free to just email Taylor or myself directly. If you choose either of the email forms, please do make sure to put public consultation in the subject line so we can keep track. And we encourage institutions and organizations to collate your feedback where possible, so it all comes to us together. So that is the public consultation. We really encourage and look forward to hearing back from you. That is the point of this public consultation. We really encourage the feedback. That is a huge component of how all of SBTN's documents and guidance is developed. We think it's a really critical component of the SBTN process and how we ensure that SBTN methods and guidance are robust and truly the best available science. So what is next for the Ocean Hub? As Taylor said at the beginning, this public consultation period is open for a full 6 weeks, which means it's available until October 22nd. Once that closes, or even starting early because it will be a rolling public consultation, we will begin incorporating this feedback into our guidance document. We will be publishing this version 1 guidance for the seafood sector in the first quarter of 2025. And almost immediately, we'll be launching into version 2 development. We saw a question come in on this, on whether we'll be expanding guidance for more and targets for more sectors. That's certainly on the horizon for us. Our version 2 will increase the depth of our seafood guidance, increase the tools and resources available, as well as increasing the reach of our targets to more sectors. That is certainly in the plan for the Ocean Hub. And so with that, we want to make sure there is plenty of time to answer any questions we haven't gotten to, leave space. So again, thank you so much for joining us today and for participating in this very critical component of our method development, which is the public consultation. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat and we can answer any we haven't gotten to yet. So I see, let's see. See a question about, will the targets be expanded to include animal welfare as part of social responsibility? Animal welfare has been something that's been on the mind of the Ocean Hub since starting our version 1 development, and is something we're definitely interested in addressing. I think if we tackle animal welfare, it would be as a inclusive target rather than within our social responsibility guidance. But I think that's a really interesting approach to animal welfare, is to include it within social responsibility, and something we can certainly consider. But animal welfare is certainly a pressure and an indicator that has been broached several times within the Ocean Hub and is kind of on the list of things we are looking at to address as we move forward.
Thanks, Alice. And we have a question for you, Varsha, about who will be in charge of tracking and making sure targets are being met, whether individuals or institutions.
Thanks, Susanna, and thanks whoever asked this question. It's a good one. And as you saw when we walked through our 5-step framework, we kind of said, where are we now? And that's with guidance from steps 1 through 3, now with the new ocean targets. Our guidance on step 4, which are actions to take to achieve targets, and step 5, which is the MRV process, or measurement, reporting, and verification process around progress made towards targets and eventually target achievement, is yet to come. So in the next year, you can anticipate an initial scoping paper for SBTN that is going to explain our approach to that process and how we're enabling accountability within the system. I'd also like to differentiate for those who are newer to SBTN this from the validation process, which is now something that's housed independently from SBTN in the accountability accelerator. So when companies eventually submit their targets for oceans, that's when it will be validated and checked. And the verification process is one that complements that. So hopefully that's helpful. You can look for more for us soon.
Thanks so much, Varsha. There are several questions that relate to the intersection of target setting for seafood with third-party certification standards and how these relate, how third-party certifications may be used with regards to this process. So Alice and Taylor, if either of you would like to answer those questions.
Yeah, we are what we would like. One of the things that we say is that we are kind of certification agnostic. We very much encourage companies to seek out certification where possible, particularly as certification can provide assurances on traceability and data collection. However, certification does not constitute a alternative to target setting or a pass on target setting. And so we see a lot of alignment, and we look towards and drew on particularly MSC standards and ASC standards for some of the thresholds and some of the science that we use in our targets. However, and so there's a lot of alignment, and we really looked towards creating we're moving towards as much interoperability as possible, particularly for companies when it comes to data collection, data alignment, for feasibility reasons. I did see a question particularly about where MSC standards exceeds or meets or aligns with targets. SBTN is not a certification standard. It is not a labeling process. And so there are some pretty distinct differences. MSC standards have a much larger set of indicators that are assessed. And they have a very distinct auditing process, but there is a lot of alignment in terms of the set of indicators that SBTN, that the Ocean Hub has selected for us, particularly on overexploitation. We are using very similar metrics for overexploitation, and on very similar metrics for habitat health and for marine wildlife, the endangered, threatened, and protected species. But the MSC standards have far more indicators. Obviously, it's a larger suite of indicators. I don't know if they have anything to add to that, Taylor. And similar goes for ASC in terms of habitat protections.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it well. I think one of the things that we're thinking about is how companies find the necessary data on state of nature and their pressure indicators. And if they are working with these third-party certifications, that's certainly an area that they can go to so that they're not sort of duplicating their efforts and having to search for that data elsewhere. I think we got another question about does this guidance address the issue of particularly destructive fishing gears such as bottom trawling? Yes, that would be covered. That would be one of the types of wild capture fishing methods that would be covered in our protect structural marine habitats target. And sort of a similar, not a similar question, but a similar target. I think the habitats target could also cover seaweed farming, both potential impacts from that seaweed farming might generate on the surrounding habitats, whether that is positive or negative. Seaweed farming could also be a potential solution to mitigating certain pressures, such as pollution from other types of aquaculture.
We have some questions about how to decide about thresholds and limits in target setting, how that's based on scientific evidence. So perhaps Alice and Taylor, if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more about the target setting process and the guidance relating to that.
Certainly. Sorry, I'm scrolling through the questions. Is there anything specific about thresholds? Oh, I see one here. How do you decide the thresholds in target setting? Yes, so we came together with our steering committee and did use kind of best available scientific evidence. So as Varsha was describing kind of how we define a science-based target, we look at kind of Earth's limits, what is considered necessary for halting and reversing nature loss. And so particularly when we look at seafood and fish stocks and the ocean biodiversity impacted by wild capture and aquaculture. We think about what are the limits of this seafood industry, both wild capture and aquaculture, their pressures on nature, and what are the limits of those. So we think about overexploitation. What are the limits? And what have we learned about fishing mortality and standing stock biomass limits of overexploitation? For habitat, the habitat protection target, we think about, as you know, Taylor was just talking about, kind of destructive fishing gear, and then also outputs from aquaculture facilities, effluent, etc. And the endangered, threatened, and protected marine wildlife target, this one was slightly trickier, as there's particularly when it comes to a company's own supply chain, it is very difficult to get hard data on the number of interactions, of bycatch, of entanglements, etc. But so yes, we're really going to the science, to the known kind of limits of what needs to be capped and where are the limits for nature and biodiversity to recover. And that is where we are setting the thresholds for the targets. I see just quickly a question about having focused risks to endangered, threatened, and protected species instead of a more overarching biodiversity target. Just very quickly, particularly we were doing that because of needing to have a defined scope for a target. If a target is too broad, it can be very difficult for to define the science, have it be achievable, have it have it be achievable for companies, have it be easy to have it be navigable, and not have it be measuring 5 or 6 different things. But there is definitely that target. We do intend to expand it in scope to be more than just endangered, threatened, and protected marine wildlife, and include more marine wildlife as we move forward. So it's more of a foundational target as we get the structure really sounded out, and then we can move forward.
Alice and Taylor, there are some questions about how to use SBTN within the context of data poor fisheries. So if you want to elaborate on the SBTN process with regards to local knowledge and science around the state of nature and nature needs.
Sure. So within the SBTN guidance, and this is similar across the Ocean Hub as well as the Freshwater and Land Hub, there is a stakeholder engagement process. So while, for example, our first target around overexploitation ideally relies on stock assessments and that quantitative data to assess state of nature, that's not always available. So here, companies would need to identify stakeholders in order to gather more qualitative data on that state of nature from data poor fisheries, those on the ground, nonprofits, local fishers, and the targets in that case are going to be shaped a little bit differently because companies are not necessarily going to be able to set quantitative values for their targets.
We also had a question come in about water quality and pollution addressed. Particularly, this would be related to aquaculture impacts. As I kind of touched on briefly a little earlier, companies, this would be a kind of an operations pathway target under habitat protections. And companies would be expected to maintain standards of best practice, and particularly as it relates to where they are sited. And they would be monitoring their outputs and maintaining those standards of best practice as related to the outputs of their system. So that is primarily, they would be expected to begin monitoring. Hopefully they are already monitoring, but if not, start monitoring outputs at their system and ideally near the habitats surrounding their facilities as well. And what they are monitoring precisely is slightly going to be dependent on the type of facility, what is known to be outputted, but it's typically effluent, antibiotics, nitrogen and phosphorus is often listed highly. But because there's such a wide range of aquaculture facilities and habitat types, this is an area where there is certainly a lack of true prescriptiveness in the guidance, because there needs to be flexibility for the variety of aquaculture facility types. And we really point towards things like the ASC standards, which you can go to and click on a large variety of facility types dependent on the species being farmed. And we really point towards those as the standards of best practice that companies can be looking towards.
So we have a question about engagement targets. Are engagement targets aiming to support marine protected areas, and will they be linked? There's certainly potential for there to be linkages between engagement targets and MPAs. It really depends on what is needed in terms of what is needed for the health of that given component of nature. So engagement targets focus on at the jurisdictional level, on the seascape level, getting companies to contribute to those positive conservation outcomes, whether that's in the management space or related to gear improvements, potential for our overexploitation target, fishery improvement projects are a potential option. So there's really a lot of different types of engagements that are on the table for that pathway for each of the targets. And then I think we're gonna wrap up pretty soon. Just to close it out with one final question: which topics are highest on the list of candidates for the next sectors to be addressed after seafood? So we will continue to incorporate seafood into the methodology as we expand, but our goal is to make this accessible to a wider variety of companies and sectors in the blue economy. Some specific sectors that we're thinking about are offshore renewable energy, shipping and the maritime industry, coastal development, and tourism. And this will likely build off of the foundation that we've developed through the seafood guidance, starting with our habitat protection target, again, expanding that so it's accessible to a wider variety of companies, and then our endangered, threatened, and protected marine wildlife target, expanding that so it's again more accessible, but also expanding it so that it doesn't just include those ETP species, but a wider range of marine wildlife that's not necessarily listed or critically endangered, but does have interactions with ocean industries. And with that, we will wrap up. I want to thank everyone for being here today and for your great questions. We will download our Q&A after we wrap up, and try and answer as many as possible that we weren't able to get to today. We will also send around this recording and the slide deck. And again, invite you to email us with any questions, review the public consultation, and submit your feedback either via the Google form or a Google Doc and emailing that directly to Alice and myself. We're really looking forward to seeing that and really enhancing this guidance to a point where we can really create positive change for nature and biodiversity on the ocean. Thank you.